Thank you. Is it okay to start now?
Yes.
Yes.
Is it okay if we record it?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, good, because it's recording.
Okay, let's start then. So I would like to say, first of all, thank you, Mikhail, for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for your interest. I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to be able to be part of an event which is being hosted by a center that I would consider one of the powerhouses of historical linguistics in the world. So it feels great to be, in a sense, a part of it. So thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity. So we're going to talk today about some initial grapplings and tentative findings that have been brought up by some of my historical linguistic investigations in lowland South America. So as a general organization or summary of what's going on, we are going to start with a very brief discussion of some of the background information on the ethnolinguistic landscape of Western Amazon. And then we're going to talk about some issues that are perhaps of greater historiographic interest, but they have, I think, a lot to say about the way proposed long-distance relationships have been approached and addressed in the recent history of historical linguistics of South American language. And then we come to the final and core section of the presentation, which is more closely related and concerned with substantive issues. So what I'm going basically to argue here is that the idea of a genealogical relation between these two language families, Arawakan and Arawan, has been dismissed with a certain amount of rashness. And I think that we should dispel the idea, which seems to be an orthodox understanding now, that these two language families are so different that there would be no point in trying to find significant historical associations between these two language families. And by historical association, I'm concerned not only with a possible genealogical link, but also with interesting contact relations, including not only the transfer of lexical material, but also some amount of morphosynthetic convergence, which might result from continued interaction between speakers of different languages. And I will do so by presenting some initial findings on similarities between these languages, similarities that are at this point at least ambiguous and that could indicate deeper contact or a genealogical relationship, but I will take no definite stand on the matter. And I'm also going to address some more interesting cases of similarities that are likely due to contact, to basically lexical borrowing, but which are more interesting than is usually realized. So what I'm going to present to you here is basically an outgrowth of separate projects that I have. And these projects are basically concerned with a short distance, run-of-the-mill common application of the comparative method to these two language families. But at every moment, I think it's unavoidable to touch, or at least to try to weigh on, this recurring idea that these two language families, albeit separate, have some kind of historical relation. So this initial thoughts about the nature of these historical relations is what makes the content of this presentation. So starting with the ethnolinguistic background, we have here a map of the Amazon basin with some adjacent regions included, like the central Brazilian plateau, parts of the Andes here in the west, and parts of the Guiana Shield here in the north, where we have Venezuela and Colombia, for instance. Now, the region we are concerned, which is an important and interesting region from the ethnolinguistic point of view, is the so-called Juruá-Purus region. Juruá and Purus are two of the major southern affluents of the Amazon River. And in this region, or in adjacent regions that are historically and culturally connected to this region, we find a number of groups that belong to the Arawakan language family. So here in the West, we have the Campan branch. Here we have the Purus branch of the Arawakan family. And here we have the so-called Bolivia-Paraná branch of the Arawakan language family, which is located in the upper courses of the Madeira River and in formative headwater rivers like the Madre de Dios. We also have here interpassed with these Arawakan groups, the Arawan language family, which in a sense will be the focus of our talk. We also have representatives of the Panoan language family, which exists here in basically two blocks, a northern one and a more southern block of Panoan language. And we also have representatives of the smaller Catuquina-Canamari language family. So this pattern of discontinuous distribution of language families is actually quite typical and maybe is actually the norm for South America. There are different explanations for this, but they need not concern us here. Now, aside from the existence of different groups interacting in this region, the Juruá-Purus region is also important for the history of these groups because it's usually conceptualized as a kind of corridor for the spread or the migration of Arawakan speakers coming from their presumed homeland here, which would be closer to the central course of the Amazon River. So it's usually assumed that all these smaller families, smaller in comparison to Arawakan, would be native to this region, and that Arawakan speakers would have been or started to be in contact with them as they migrated through this region, eventually reaching, in particular, this region here in the upper Madeira in what is now the nation state of Bolivia. So this is basically the ethnohistorical and ethnolinguistic background that we need, and we will need later on in order to interpret some of the language contact facts. So let's start now with a brief introduction to the two families. So the Arawan language family was first recognized in the late 19th century in the work of Daniel Brinton, which is an important figure in early classifications of South American language. And it was basically established on a comparison, a lexical, very limited lexical comparison of two languages, Paumari, then called Pamari, and Arawa, which is a currently extinct language, but which gave the name to the whole language group. So as is the case with most South American language families, there is very little historical comparative work done on Arawan language. So the latest and basically the sole comparative work we have is a longish paper by Robert Dixon from 2004, where he presents a basic phonological reconstruction of Proto-Arawan with a limited lexicon of reconstructed etma and a few amendments, a few footnotes, if you will, were added in later work by Stefan Dienst. So as it happens also in general in South America, some of the member languages are largely undescribed. And this is in particular the case of Surwaha, which is spoken by a group, by an indigenous group of the Brazilian Amazon that was only recently contacted. So Arawan is a relatively shallow and small language family, as is again typical for most language groups in South America. We have basically a Madiha dialect cluster or Madiha language with 3 different varieties, and a Madi dialect cluster, again with 3 recognized varieties. And there is some evidence, not solid enough, but some evidence that they constitute an intermediate branch which could be called Madi Madiha. And then we have the other 3 languages as basal branches, Surwaha, Palmari, and the extinct and very poorly attested Arawa. So this is basically the structure of the Arawan language family. Now, Arawakan, as some of you might know, is a whole different story. So the language family was recognized about 100 years before Arawan. Some of the languages of this family have started to be described early on in the first centuries of European colonization. And it's a language family that's much more geographically dispersed. In fact, it's traditionally considered the most geographically spread language family of the New World. So at the start of the European invasion, we had Arawakan languages spoken from the Caribbean here in the north, well outside of South America, to the upper Paraguay River here in the south. But even so, for Arawakan, and maybe perhaps as a function of the large number of languages that make this language family, comparative work is again very limited. All we have on a family-wide basis is a proposal of somewhat 203 reconstructed etma in a work by David Payne from 1991. It's a good work. It's interesting in many aspects, but has a number of methodological limitations. But in relative terms, if you compare to the kind of material that was produced until that time about South American language, it's relatively good. And we have a number of smaller studies concentrated on specific branches. Some of this work has been authored by me and by other colleagues. And of course, that there is no way we could cover all of this in this presentation. So what I show you here is a very tentative and preliminary phylogenetic structure for the family that has been produced as part of the comparative Arawakan project, of which I'm part, which is led by Lev Michael from UC Berkeley. And it's lexically based. It's basically founded on the recognition of lexical cognate classes. And it's a consensus tree. And this is presented here just to show the difference in the sheer magnitude of the family when compared to the much shallower Arawan language family. Now, one could argue that starting at the first decades of the 20th century and at the end of the 19th century, a very popular idea that began to crystallize among students of South American prehistory and the students of South American indigenous peoples was this idea of Arawakan speakers as a kind of Herrenvolk, as people used to describe them using German cultural geographic terminology. And the idea that they were somehow a kind of intermediate high-level civilization between the supposedly primitive civilizations of the rainforest and the high cultures of Mesoamerica or the Andes. So possibly as triggered by this conception, there began a number of proposals of long-distance language relationships that would try to reduce the diversity of lowland South American language by relating smaller language families to this broader and larger Arawakan language family. And they were, of course, usually based on very limited evidence. Many times, linguistic evidence was not even considered. So they were all based on cultural similarities that were perceived by travelers, missionaries, and so on. And among these hypotheses was the idea of a connection between Arawakan and Arawan language. Now, going ahead in time, we can say that the current consensus is that these so-called macro-Arawakan proposals are all problematic and that we should reject them. But there is a usual plot in the way these proposals, not only macro-Arawakan, but arguably elsewhere in South America, there is a usual plot that is followed when these proposals are rejected. So usually there is a selective presentation and consideration of the most obvious flaws in the proposals. Usually the weaker etymologies, the weaker comparisons are considered, and the proposals are never tested in any systematic manner, and the hypotheses are abandoned. So usually this is the plot that is followed. And there are some, in my view, some negative consequences to this, because yeah, if we look at the recent history of historical linguistics on the languages of South America, a consequence of this is that this hypothesis or investigation on this hypothesis is simply shut down, and it's assumed that all the similarities unearthed are basically the result either of chance resemblances or very shallow and historically recent loanword diffusion. And as a consequence of this fact, it's not only that the hypotheses are never addressed as claims of genealogical relationship, but we are never told, we end up never knowing whether the patterns attested could be the result of other historically interesting relations between the speakers of this language. So there is the creation of this major gap in our understanding of this, of the history of the continent, of the history of this language and peoples. And of course that the very negative, and one might say well-deserved, but the very negative accolade of Greenberg's language in the Americas has certainly contributed to this, to an entrenchment of this idea. So people in South America are usually very wary of considering or of even discussing hypotheses of long distance relationship. So let's see now what happened to Arawakan-Arawan specifically among these macro Arawakan proposals. So the original proposal of a Arawakan-Arawan relation is a paper by the German ethnologist Paul Ehrenreich from the end of the 19th century, where he basically presented some lexical comparisons between especially Pama-Nyungan, which was the best known and the earliest known Arawan language, and some language that were considered at the time to be Arawakan language. Now, this idea by Ehrenreich was accepted by some researchers in the 20th century, and it was accepted by Esther Matheson. And she set to herself the task of trying to reconstruct proto-macro Arawakan, comparing bona fide Arawakan language to some other groups like Harakambet and Arawan, which were then considered to be part of this higher level genetic entity. And as you can see here, her work is consensually understood as having serious limitations of not only an empirical kind, but also methodological kind. There is this kind of, some people call it proto-language stuffing, which is the production of this Frankenstein etma, which try to collapse forms that are supposed cognates that are actually not comparable at all. This is very characteristic of work on South American historical linguistics done at this time. Now, the current consensus on around the rejection of this idea was basically built by the work of Robert Dixon, first in the Cambridge volume on the Amazonian language from 1999, and in Dixon's own work on the reconstruction of Proto-Arawan. But the problem is that here as well, we see again the usual plot for hypothesis rejection for this kind of proposal on South American language. So there is, first of all, a kind of one-sided concentration on the weaker etymologies. So Dixon here, for instance, considers explicitly only one comparison advanced by Ehrenreich, and he says that the set is typical. So it's a comparison that involves a cultural item. It's not an item which would be included on anyone's basic vocabulary list. And in fact, there is a lot of formal deviation and formal differences that kind of make this set really uninviting, even as a first pass hypothesis on genetic relationship. However, when we look at other comparisons that appear in Ehrenreich's original paper, we find other comparisons that are not as problematic as the one for Bo. For instance, this comparison for nose, where we have something like wiridi or widi in Arawan and kiri in the Arawakan language employed. And we have for I something like nokho and something similar in Arawakan okhu with a varying stem initial consonant. So these comparisons, which are already found in the original proposal, not that bad, at least as first pass hypothesis or as first pass etymologies, and they would certainly, for many people, for me, for instance, make it worth further investigating this this proposal. A second problem is that there is, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, an inflation of secondary sources or secondary evaluations on the proposed genetic relationship. So Dixon says, for instance, that Rodrigues, which is a popular book on the language families of Brazil, demonstrates very clearly that no genetic connection can be established between Arawa and Arawak, or Arawan and Arawakan. However, when we look at the actual work of Rodrigues, the hypothesis of a genealogical relationship is not explicitly discussed anywhere. And all he does is to present isolated lexical comparisons internal to each family. And the two families are discussed in separate. So much for the Rodrigues demonstration. And when we look at these forms, there are only 4 sets that are semantically equivalent, and only 3 of them would be considered basic by most people. And looking at some of them, we see that they are also not discouraging entirely. So if we admit some kind of semantic latitude in the comparisons, it's true that the Arawakan and Arawan forms for water are not comparable, but when we compare Arawakan for water and Arawan for river, then they are not formally that different from one another. And in the forms for hand, we can find arguably even more formal similarity. So not only does Rodrigues not propose or advance any kind of demonstration that a relationship is not tenable, but some of the data he presents is actually encouraging and inviting for further investigation. And there is, of course, a composition of errors when reference works, which are by definition, most of the time, more distantly related from a close-in evaluation of the empirical evidence, these reference works tend to cast some of the judgments as if they were written in stone. So you have like handbooks like Campbell on South American language groups, and Campbell is usually not as skeptic as Dixon is concerning putative long-range relationship in South America, but nevertheless he considers that the Dixon's treatment of the Arawakan-Arawan relationship stands as a demonstration against this proposed group, in which, as we saw, seems to be an inflation, to say the least. Now, as an entering conclusion, I would say that given that the flaws in the original proposal are not as bad as reported, as commentators seem to make them appear, I think that there is every reason to keep investigating this connection, and that we can dispel the myth that investigating this relationship, which this myth seems to be enshrined in this current orthodox position, that investigating this relationship will yield nothing of interest. Now, well, this is a kind of expression of this current view in Dixon and Eichenwald's introduction to their volume on Amazonian language, where they say that there are no lexical comparisons that are compelling enough even to be considered as first pass cognates, as probable cognates, and that the languages have entirely different grammars. Now, as I hope to show now in the presentation, I think this is a bit of an overstatement. So we are now going to start some comparison of this language, and I'm going to start with the selective typological comparison of the two language families, and mix it with this typological comparison. We will also consider cases where we have potentially significant grammatical similarities. And by grammatical similarities, I mean formally and functionally similar grammatical or functional morphemes. And then we are going to consider also some lexical similarities that seem to point either to shallower contact, to deeper contact, or even in the future might be part of the evidence for a genealogical relationship. Now, starting with the overall typological profile in the phonology, both language families and to the best of our knowledge, the reconstructed proto-language as well, have a very simple syllable structure. They feature vowel systems that lack an opposition between high and mid, for instance, in the back portion of the vowel space. And both language families have obstruent systems where glottal features like aspiration, voicing, and in the case of Proto-Arawan, also implosives, feature as contrastive elements. This is relatively rare for lowland South America, but it's found in some other language families, but it's not as common as in other parts of the world. And in overall terms of morphosyntax, both language families are essentially head marking morphosyntax. Most of the complexity goes on verbs. And this is, of course, quite typical for the morphologically more elaborate language families of South America. And the languages are also mainly suffixing, which from a typological point of view is not surprising, as there seems to be a universal preference for this. So in general typological terms, the languages are not strikingly similar, but neither there are no insurmountable differences between the languages in this very superficial evaluation of typological features. Now, going to some details, both language families feature a distinction between dependent or inalienable nouns and independent or alienable nouns. There is what is usually called a possession split. So essentially, dependent nouns can be inflected for the person or person and number of a possessor directly, as we have here in this example from Madiha, and here for Arawakan in this example from Baniwa. And both language families have morphological means to indicate that a otherwise dependent noun is operating in a particular construction as a dependent noun. So this is a kind of absolute morphology, as is usually called. And they also share the property that independent nouns cannot be directly inflected to or indexed for features of a possessor, and that we need some kind of relational noun in order to receive the relevant inflectional marks. So this is an interesting parallel. This kind of possession split is very common in South America, in lowland South America, but it's not necessarily everywhere. So for instance, Panoan language, which are part of the same region of the Purus and Juruá region of Western South America, Panoan language have no such split. So it's very common, but far from universal in South America. Now, a more interesting parallel, since it involves morphemes that are also formally comparable, is the following. So in both languages, I said that independent nouns cannot receive person indexing for a possessor, to indicate a possessor. So in Madiha, for instance, I cannot say otakara for my hand. I must say okha takara, something like my thing, the hand. But both languages have actually a way to convert, as if it were, convert independent nouns into dependent nouns. And this is effected by similar means, which consist in the addition of a suffix, which in Madiha has the form ri. So for instance, zama or zama is a independent noun, but it can be possessed, it can show inflection marks for a possessor, for the person and number of a possessor, if we add this so-called dependent state suffix. And the same pattern is found throughout the Arawakan language family. In Arawakan, we have a more complex situation because there are many distinct allomorphs, but they usually have the same structure. There is a front vowel and there is a coronal consonant here. So there are many allomorphs and they can be probably reconstructed for Proto-Arawakan, but this is a more interesting parallel because there is not only similar structure, but also similar looking morphemes. Now, another parallel that is often pointed out between the two languages, parallel of a typological kind, but also involving some kind of formal similarity between the relevant grammatical morphemes, is the existence of gender. Now, the existence of these nominal classes of gender or inflectional classes is, in an intuitive sense, it's somewhat rare in lowland South America. So this is something that has always had a major force in proposals of Arawan and Arawakan connections. So we have here an example from Madiha, where these two nouns have separate genders, and this is reflected in agreement with demonstratives. A very similar pattern can be found in Parisi, which is a Arawakan language. Now, what is more interesting here is that there is an association between a front vowel with masculine morphemes and a back vowel with feminine morphemes. Now, this is something that has been remarked about Arawakan language for a long time and is very consistent throughout the family. Within Arawan, however, this is not as consistent as we would like them to be. So if we look at other morphosyntactic subdomains where gender is a significant feature in Arawan language, we will see that there is no, that this pattern breaks away. So we have an opposition between feminine and masculine, but it's not the case that you have always a front vowel associated with masculine and a back vowel associated with feminine, which is very consistent in Arawakan, but in Arawan, this is not the case. And moreover, this pattern whereby front vowels associate with masculine and back vowels with feminine is also found in Tucanoan, which is a separate language family from northwestern Amazon. So there seems to be some areal dimension. Now, moving on to verb morphology. As I said, verb morphology is considered in this case of a more active or controlling argument, either of a negative intransitive verbs or of transitive verbs, is carried out by means of these prefixes. Now, as you can see, there is very little in the way of compelling or significant formal similarities between these markers. However, I must point out that within Arawakan itself, we have the evolution or the secondary innovation of forms that are more readily comparable to those found in Arawan language. All I'm saying with this is that the formal similarities are not really, arguably not that great. Now, both language families have a slot for valence changing or valence adjusting prefixes. And also a very, as commonly pointed out, they seem to share a verbal prefix broadly with the form ka. Now, this prefix is more correctly, it's a applicative in Arawan language, but it has, among other functions, a causative function in throughout the Arawakan language family. But I must note that, again, I don't think that this is a significant difference, because applicative causative polysemy is attested in language, which means that there is room for imagining a bridge form or a bridge context that could be used to relate these elements or these constructions in these two language families. Of course, that the coincidence could be just a coincidence, of course. Now, there is a somewhat more forced, but maybe also more interesting parallel in the verbal morphology of this language, which is the following. Now, Arawakan languages have a distinction, a formal distinction between thematic verbs and non-thematic verbs. Now, thematic verbs, which make the larger and more productive class, will feature a suffix, usually of a simple consonant vowel structure, right after the root. This is a thematic class. We're going to see some examples of this. And there is also a generalization, which is true for most languages, that the non-thematic class includes a significant number of intransitive verbs. Now, parallel to this, in Arawan language, we have a reduced number of inflecting verbs, where person marking and functional verbal morphology like tense, aspect, and mood are directly attached to the verb root, and we have a larger class of non-inflecting verbs. And again, there is a generalization that intransitive verbs are significantly prevalent in the class of inflecting verbs. So let's see in greater detail this. So basically, in a Arawan language like Madhya, we are going to have a first class of verbs where inflection, so for instance, this suffix, which codes perfective aspect and gender and agrees in gender, and this person indexing prefix, they all go in the verb root. And we have a second class, which includes verbs like ze or ze, drink, where this kind of verb-related inflection must go in a auxiliary. Now, in Arawakan, we have also, as I said, we have this class here in A of non-thematic verbs, and we have a class of thematic verbs, which will show one of a series of thematic suffixes, all of this basic shape, consonant and vowel. Now, they will appear either as word closure or interpassed between other markers. It's really a kind of thematic extension. Now, this table compares some of the similarities between the two classes. So in Arawakan, the non-thematic class of verbs is both smaller, not necessarily closed, but smaller, and intransitives are a majority of these elements. They are over-represented within this class. And the same pattern occurs with the inflecting class of verbs in Arawan language. However, the thematic class is productive. For instance, when the language adopts loan verbs, or even loan nouns that get verbalized, they will show up with a thematic extension, so to speak, a thematic suffix. And the non-inflecting one is also the productive class in Arawan. So what I'm just trying to say here is that contrary to this orthodox view, we have here another example of a grammatical or morphosyntactic difference that is not hopelessly different, because we can think, and this is plausible, that these thematic extensions of seen in Arawakan language could have originated through grammaticalization processes in past auxiliary verbs of the kind, or having as precursor constructions the same kind of construction that we find attested in Arawan language. And note that there is a rigid post-verbal position or placement for these auxiliaries in Arawan language. They cannot come or appear preceding a verb. They must necessarily come after a verb. And in fact, the initial descriptions of some Arawan language would consider these auxiliaries, as we have here, as part of the verb morphology. So what I'm trying to say here is that the languages are not hopelessly different, that there is room for further investigation of this hypothesis, and that in no way the grammatical differences between these languages make further investigation of this hypothesis a dead end. Now, for another sort of similarity, one that could be and seems to be actually related to contact, we note the following. I note the following. In some Southern Arawakan languages, there seems to be this property which seems to be isolated within the Arawakan language family, which seems to be unique, which is the existence of a number of ablaut and vowel harmony patterns in nominal morphology. So you have things like terena, where you have forms like soporo, which means maize, but whenever this stem is possessed, the vowels must all shift to a. So you have sapara, his or her maize. So this is very common in Terena, but less so in other Southern Arawakan language. That's why I'm quoting from earlier varieties of this language, because many of the modern dialects have probably leveled out these alternations. Now, it's significant that this kind of process is found, or seems to be found, restricted only in this Southern Arawakan language, because something similar is found in Arawan language. Now, in Arawan language, as we can see here below the table in A and B, likely as a consequence of the erosion of a past masculine suffix, we have in many of the daughter languages, and possibly already at Proto-Arawan levels, a similar pattern of ablaut and harmony in nominal paradigms. Now, I think that this is a significant, or possibly a significant parallel, because as we saw in the first slides on the ethnolinguistic background, we suppose that language from this subgroup of the Arawakan language family have crossed, so to speak, the region inhabited by Arawan speakers at some point during their history. And we are going to see ahead that there are other similarities as well in the lexical domain. So I think this is an interesting pattern of similarities. Now, considering moving now to the lexical evidence for contact, as I said, whenever lexical similarities have been pointed out between Arawakan and Arawan language, there is this trivial contact scenario. And what I call trivial contact is a scenario that involves historically recent or shallow transfer of lexical material between Arawan language and the local Arawakan language, which are essentially reduced to Apurina, which is a member of the Purus Arawakan branch. So this is here a quote from Dixon's work, where he considers essentially some, and briefly, some cases of borrowing from Apurina. Now, let's look at some cases where something else might be at play. So this is a etymology for a Proto-Arawan form for lake from Dixon's work. And he himself seems to consider the inclusion of this Madiha, Kulina Deni, Madiha form for lake here to be kind of suspicious. So this is actually pronounced like Koridza. And looking at this, this seems to be a rather weak etymology. I would compare only Palmari and Arawa as legitimate, and this form really seems not to fit here. Some people have pointed out, I guess, or maybe I'm the first to point out, that this looks a lot like a very common Arawakan form for lake. But when we look at the distribution of Arawakan forms for lake, we find that here in white, we have the Arawan form, Koridza. We find that forms for lake in the local, in the neighboring Arawakan groups are very different and likely unrelated. We find, however, more similar forms in Arawakan groups that that live much to the north. This is already an indication that the idea of trivial contact will not account for all the similarities. Now, we also have the case of the etymology for stone. Now, it can be reconstructed for Proto-Arawan, a form like yati for stone. But some languages, and again, Madiha, have a unrelated form for stone. And again, we find a similar pattern. If we look at the local Arawakan groups, we we would be pressed to identify in any of these a legitimate source for this form Siba. But if we look to Arawakan language further north, we find likely candidates for this as for a borrowing or a loan source. In this case, this comes from some languages that have been extinct for a long time, but are known from some vocabulary lists. Now, what's interesting here is that we can suppose that there was borrowing in this direction for the case of stone, where we have a form with an initial fricative. So this form for Arawakan forms for stone are quite likely reconstructible to something like Kuba at the Proto-Arawakan level. And I'm using a hash symbol here to indicate what some people would call a pseudo reconstruction, or something that is not that certain. So I would not honor this guess with a asterisk as if adequate reconstruction had been done, because we have no such thing for Arawakan. So I'm using this hash symbol for approximate reconstruction. But anyway, many Arawakan languages have a velar stop here. And of the languages that are geographically close to Arawan language, you have the extinct language Yumana with a reflex of this form that has a fricative, just like in the adopted Arawan form. Now, if we look at other languages, Arawakan languages that were spoken further north, we also find other nice similarities that could be indication of borrowing, such as the form for sun, but now the direction of borrowing is reversed. Most of the Arawakan language would have, in this region, would have a form for sun that is somewhat related to Kamui or Kamu. And we have in Kawishana a form Mahi, which is quite similar to the Madiha form for sun, which can be reconstructed for Proto-Arawan. Now, for Jaguar, most Arawakan languages in the region of the main course of the Amazon River, would have something like Zawi or Jawi, which is also very common in general in northern Arawakan language. But we find in Yumana and Kawishana a form like Jama or Jamari. Now, here, I think it's more speculative, but see that aside from forms like Jomahi, which are found throughout the Arawan language family, it's not uncommon, and not only for Arawan speakers, but throughout the Amazon, to use avoidance speech when referring to certain dangerous animals, like the jaguar, or animals that are considered dangerous for other reasons, like the tapir. And in Arawan language, some languages use the form Yama, which means woods, forest, but also means thing or something from the forest, in order to refer to the jaguar and to other animals. So this is more speculative here, but I think it's also interesting, an interesting parallel. And here we have the form for lake. We have seen that we have here in Arawan O, while most Arawakan forms have A, but in at least one poorly attested Arawakan language, which is Wirina, which used to be spoken in the Rio Negro, we have a form with O, okay? Now, both of these languages, Yumana and Kayushana, were spoken closer to the main course of the Amazon River. This suggests that Arawan speakers used to live closer to the main course of the Amazon River, further north to where we find them today. We are going to see ahead some other implications of these findings. Now we come to a separate set of what we could call interesting lexical parallels. Now, here are some forms where we have very similar forms with similar meanings in Arawan language and in Arawakan language. Now, what is significant here is that the vast majority of these similar items seem to be restricted to Southern Arawakan language, or in the case here of this form and this one, also in the local Arawakan groups, which are the language of the Purus branch. Now for another set of lexical evidence, which is arguably more interesting, because it could be an indication of a deeper connection, either in terms of contact or in terms of a presumed genealogical relationship. Now, these forms here in Arawan are all locative nouns. So they behave morphosyntactically like nouns, but they many times express notions that would be expressed by postpositions or by prepositions in other languages. Now, we know, and this is very common in South America, that these postposition-like elements or preposition-like elements originate in nouns. This is very well attested, for instance, in Arawakan language. Now, I have found some similarities between these locative nouns and nouns in Arawakan language that are many times also used to express location. So we have here something like dope, which means under in Madiha. And throughout the Arawakan language family, we have forms like ope, api, or abo to express the similar notion. Now, these forms within Arawakan are related to the root for bone. I think that the basis of the metaphor is because the bone lies underneath or below the skin or the flesh. Now, it's interesting that Arawakan forms for bone usually present an initial consonant, silent here, indicated here in Payne's reconstruction, which is of difficult reconstruction, but it could be significant that an initial consonant is also found in the Madiha form. Now, the same for this expression. This locative noun in Madiha is usually employed as a kind of adverbial, meaning that you are performing the action signaled by the verb while in a path. Now, Zanapo is arguably comparable to Arawakan forms for path. So we have something close to terena chene or jene, and we also have within Arawakan forms for path like wapo. And what is interesting is that these two separate atma often occur combined, as here in the very eroded reflex in Baniwa, ini po. We could assume something like chene po for a previous stage of the language, and I am explicitly comparing this to Madiha Zanapo. Now for Madiha Nani, which means in front of, and in many languages, this is far from surprising, expressions, locative expressions like this derive from nouns for face or forehead. Now, this is the case, for instance, for terena, where we have nonne, which can mean either face or can be used as a locational or locative expression meaning in front of. And I think here that the formal and functional match is also interesting and significant. We are now approaching the end. As I said, one of the problems is that proposed longer range hypotheses are seldom tested in a South American context. So as a very initial approach to this testing, I have compared within a closed meaning list. I could have selected others, and in the future, I hope to work with other lists. But I have selected for this purpose the Leipzig Jakarta meaning list. There is, of course, a problem in doing this kind of comparison because we would like to compare Proto-Arawakan and Proto-Arawan, but as I said, we have no extensive lexical reconstructions for the two families, and we would need a much improved phonological reconstruction for Proto-Arawakan. Now, what I've found is, and for the 100 meaning list, I have found only 6 relatively convincing or interesting matches between putative Proto-Arawan forms and putative Proto-Arawakan forms. Now, of course, how compelling these comparisons are depends on a number of factors. So Arawan for nose, for instance, can be probably derived internally from widi hodi, nose hole. So at some point, it really meant nasal cavity. This match in the forms for root is much more tentative. Currently, I have no good account of this initial syllable here. This final syllable is probably a suffix, but this initial syllable must be explained somehow in order to make the comparison more compelling. And it's likely that this final a prefix that is commonly involved in monovalent predicates. And in the Arawan form, this final syllable is likely a suffix. So the comparison is somewhat, it's kind of interesting. So as a kind of, as we get close to the end, we might ask, what's the verdict so far on these historical relations? So I would say at the moment that the grammatical differences between the two families are contra Dixon, contra the established or orthodox view. They are not strong enough to shut down investigation on the matter. And I would also say that this very limited, very tentative first pass examination of grammatical and lexical similarities that have been presented here suggest that there has been some amount of superficial contact between Arawan groups and Arawakan speakers further north. This comes as news because this was not accepted until the moment, and that there is a possibility of there have been more intense contact between Arawan groups and Arawakan speakers further south, more specifically Arawakan speakers of language of the Bolivia-Paraná branch. This is what was included here as what I called miscellaneous lexical evidence and the patterns of nominal, ablaut, and harmony. And I would say that part of the lexical evidence is, perhaps you can see that I am overcautious here, could be indicative either of a genetic relationship or of an even earlier loan layer of loanword diffusion. And I'm talking about the positional nouns and about the limited matchings in the Leipzig Jakarta meaning list. So what's next? So as I mentioned many times, of course, that in order for these historical relations to be properly assessed, we need improved reconstructions of Proto-Arawakan, and we also need improved reconstructions of Proto-Arawan, which is much more feasible given the smaller size of the family, but we need more data on some of the language, and a revision of some aspects of Dixon's original reconstruction is definitely in order. Now, some tentative conclusions for the external history of these speakers. I would say that we can suggest that Arawan groups used to live more to the north, closer to the main course of the Amazon River. So they would have at some point in their recent history moved upriver to the south. And if this is true, this is somewhat surprising given some assumptions we have about the history of these peoples, because it's usually assumed that Arawan speakers were hunter-gatherers until recently. And it's also assumed that the riverbanks of major rivers in the Amazon were populated, densely populated by agriculturalists. But this presence of Arawan speakers close to regions of intensive agriculture would be consistent with the independent finding here in 3, that at least one Arawakan language, Apurina, seems to have adopted a form for maize from Arawan language. So if they were donors of terms for cultigens, for cultivated genera, then it's not so absurd to imagine that they were in fact intimate with agriculture at some point in their history. And as I said, we would also like to think that Bolivia Paraná speakers, when moving south, stayed or were for some time in contact with speakers of Arawan language. So in graphical terms, we would have something like this. Arawan and Arawakan speakers living close together by the main course of the Amazon River. Then we would have at some point Arawan speakers migrating north to their historically attested locations. And then we would have the start of the migration of the ancestors of Bolivia Paraná speakers, and they would have dwelt for some time alongside Arawan speakers before moving to their historically known location. So this is a kind of scenario that could be suggested, and I think it's interesting because it's being suggested for the first time on a very tentative basis, I must underline, on the basis of this linguistic evidence. So the end. I hope you have enjoyed this talk. And again, I would like to say that I'm grateful for the invitation.
Oh, George has a question.
No, well, I actually do have a question. I wasn't going to ask it first, but so obviously I was very interested in the. Oh, okay, first, thanks for the great talk. I really enjoyed everything, and it was very instructive. But I wanted to ask, what about the pronoun systems? Are there any significant resemblances between things like first, second person pronouns?
Okay, I'll share the presentation again and then answer the questions going over the slides. I think it's better.
Mm-hmm.
So let me share the screen. Okay, let's come back to. So yeah. Okay, let's see. Okay, now these elements here are bound markers. They are bound markers. They will occur on verbs on nouns and on what we could call postpositions. In both language families, independent pronouns are derived in the same manner. You would have one of these markers prefixed to a base that some people would say would gloss simply as a pronominal base, but which in many cases are bases that derive quite transparently from datic elements. So in Arawan language, for instance, this is the O prefix that indexes a first person singular participant, but I have an independent noun owa. For second person, I have independent tia. For first person plural, ya. And the same general pattern is seen in Arawakan. Now, for similarities in the shape of these pronouns, I would say that this is all we have. I mean, they are not entirely, they are not very similar, but as I said, we have evidence from within Arawakan for relatively short chronology changes that have moved some Arawakan language into forms that more closely resemble the Arawan language. Of course, this is no argument for proposing that the forms can be cognate. This is just an indication, I think, that the formal disparity between Arawan and Arawakan forms is not as great as one might suppose. And I have not included here, but for third person, there is also a similar form between the languages. There is a prefix or a formative, which is basically po or pa in both language families, and which is used to form independent forms for third person. Mm-hmm. So in Arawan, you would say powa or poni for an independent pronoun for third person. And throughout the Arawakan language family, it's very common to have forms with a similar function that have a base po or pa. So I would say that these are all the similarities we have.
And is that change from nu to and pi to ti, what kind of change is that? Is that regular phonetic change, or is that?
Yeah, so in this case here for yaulapiti, you can say that there was a more regular process of coronalization of labials, because this vowel here, u, it was fronted to e, and this vowel caused a coronalization of labials, which is regular in Yualapiti. Okay. In the case of Wapishana, in the reduction of this initial nasal, I would be more cautious. The fact is that throughout the Arawakan language family, there are many changes that have affected these elements, these prefixes, that at least do not seem very regular. But as I said, we have a huge gap in the knowledge about the language family, but they don't seem to be regular. They seem to have applied to some morphological elements specifically.
I see. So, but if we wanted to rationalize the similarity between these shifted forms in Arawakan and the forms in Arawan, we would have to assume that similar phonological processes took place in
exactly
Arawan and a subpart of Arawakan.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Any other questions from other?
Maybe I have a question.
Yes, Andrei.
Thank you for this presentation. I was wondering, I think I saw in some slides an Arawan prefix to, or indefinite possessor, absolute, whatever.
Exactly.
It reminded me, I think there is a similar, an identical prefix with an identical function in some Wichi dialects, if I'm not mistaken. And I was wondering if
in
there
Wichi
is
from the Chaco.
in Purus. Yeah, but I think I have seen it somewhere else, maybe even in Arawakan. I'm not. There is also O, which.
No, I can't remember. I mean, the closest formal parallel in Purus Arawakan would be a prefix po with a bilabial p and o, but it's not a marker of nominal morphology. It's a prefix that seems to be involved in deriving adjectives, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely look for other parallels, but at least from the top of my head now, I can't recall any similar prefix in Arawakan. I mean, similar to to. Obrigado pela pergunta. Thanks for the question.
I was thinking about Apurina, but I don't remember if it was what exactly was the function.
Okay.
Any other questions or remarks?
I have a small question.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much. Very interesting talk and very instructive, of course. You have mentioned in the very beginning that these continuous patterns of distributions in the region, that you have an explanation for it. Can you elaborate?
No, yeah, I said that in the literature, there are many proposed explanations, possibly not competing explanations. They are all part of the story, maybe. So in one case, there is a popular explanation which goes back to an archaeologist, Donald Lathrop. And he has this model of the population ecology of the Amazon, which is called the cardiac model, because he sees major rivers, affluents of the Amazon, like arteries of a heart. And his idea is that when groups close to the main river courses innovated agriculture, they were given a kind of technological upper hand, and their populations started to grow. And as their populations started growing, they started to push smaller groups in the direction of the headwaters. So of course that this population movement did not respect boundaries of language families. So this is one of the ideas, Lathrop's cardiac model, that would relate the distribution of ethnolinguistic groups to these innovations in subsistence techniques that would be related to the main courses of rivers, because the most fertile soils occur in the riverbanks of these major rivers. Now, this is one idea. There are other proposals related, for instance, to continent-wide trade networks. So this is one idea. So groups would move to some locations because they would secure the position in trade chains. So for instance, here close to the Andes, we have some places that were vital in trade chains for salt. So some of the groups would move to these regions and they would establish themselves in these regions in order to secure a privileged position in trade networks. This is one idea. Another idea, which is more concrete because it's related to recent events in the post-colonial history, is that this patchy distribution would simply result from disruptions that were caused by European settlement and by colonization. So we can see that many groups have been cluttered in headwaters regions. So these regions along the main courses of rivers are essentially depopulated from indigenous populations in the Amazon. Most of the indigenous groups are located in headwaters. So this could be a partial explanation. And finally, there are some people that suggest that there are certain cultural values at place in the Amazon that would foster this kind of situation. A cultural value, for instance, that would promote economic integration, cultural interaction without the loss of linguistic diversity. So this is also proposed by some people. So there are a bunch of not essentially mutually exclusive proposals, but I would say that it's definitely a general feature of South America, these discontinuous groups, but the correct set of explanations, I think it's a matter for further research.
Thank you very much. I actually was looking like we have similar patterns in Mesoamerica, and
yeah,
very difficult to explain. I would say impossible in South West Africa, for example. So I was looking, maybe you have a nice way to explaining it, but it wouldn't work in Mesoamerica.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? We still have about 5 minutes.
I have a small, first of all, I want to thank you for this very instructive topic. And for example, I have never thought about the origin of the thematic elements in languages like Indo-European. It was very instructive. And could you please return to the slides about the words for stern and the other. There was a word like zipa or sipa or siba.
Okay, for stone. Let's see.
Yes. Sipa.
Okay. Let's see.
Yes,
here.
The previous one. The previous one. Yes. Yes. And what about that word hippo? Because I think S can easily move to ha historically.
No. These are the forms for lake, not stone. Lake.
Yes.
So these are the forms for lake. Now stone is here.
This one, stone. I can find that word zepa. Yes.
Yeah.
To the north, there is a word like hippa, and it seems to me that a sound like z or z, a sibilant could easily move to ha.
Okay, no, you're right. So these forms here, hippa and zepa, they are definitely related. I mean, they are definitely related. So they are cognates. They are certain cognates. Okay. So what I was just trying to stress that since this word here is, we all agree it's a loan, we should look for a source form that also has a coronal fricative. And the closest one we have is this one.
Yes, I see. Thank you.
So, okay. Thank you.
I have a small question. Can you return to the slide with the word lake?
Okay.
So my question is whether the word like Kalitsa is an archaism inherited from Proto-Arawakan, or is it an innovation in this particular group in the north?
So it's currently accepted as Proto-Arawakan, but many, I couldn't say, I mean, for this etymology in particular, but many of the etymologies in Payne's work, from where most Proto-Arawakan etymologies are taken, many of his etymologies have distributional problems. So many of the etymologies are geographically restricted to certain subgroups, but still he reconstructs for Proto-Arawakan. Your question is actually very good, because it's not necessarily that this is a inherited term for Proto-Arawakan. It's very general throughout the North, And I remembered, I'm almost sure that Payne reconstructed it for Proto-Arawakan, but I can't say now how good his etymology is. But anyway, I think that what is more important is that this form here doesn't look like any of the neighboring Arawakan forms for lake, and it's definitely not from Proto-Arawan. So the idea that it could derive from a Arawakan form, a Arawakan source form like this, is at least worth considering. But yeah, your question is good, because I cannot vouch for the Proto-Arawakan provenance of this element, but it's of course certainly a significant factor.
What I meant was that if the Kalitsa word is an innovation in some northern groups, then we have a case for direct contact between Arawan and northern Arawakan groups. And if it is inherited from Proto-Arawakan, then a possible scenario would be that groups that are now in contact with Arawan inherited this word, then Arawan borrowed it, and then they replaced it with these new words like people and others.
Exactly. This is a possibility, of course. It can't be discarded, of course. And I have included a single Kalitsa form here, but actually you can find this this form or related forms throughout language that were spoken here and here, close to the main course of the Amazon River. So it was more widespread. But your thought is of course correct. Yes, there is this possibility that this form was once present in this language and was later replaced. There is, of course, in trying to understand the contact between Arawan and Arawakan groups, there is a serious concern with chronology. I mean, when did this eventual context took place? Not only in geography, in geographical terms, but also in time. So, but of course, all of this would require further and more detailed reconstruction in both families. But thanks for the question.
Sure. I was just going to mention that in Eastern Bolivia, in Spanish, they call the word for the lake in local Spanish is curichi. Obviously of indigenous origin, but I don't. It's not Chiquitano. I don't have a clue of where it was borrowed from. Maybe.
Really, curichi.
Curichi, but with an e. There is also a creek when you cross the border from Mato Grosso from Cáceres going to Bolivia. There is a place called Coricha, which is a small river. I'm not sure there can be a relation, but it could be a Chanever.
Yeah, this is interesting. And there is this very odd Arawakan language here in Bolivia, Apolista, which some people question whether it was a real language or not, but assuming that it was a real language, Apolista has as one of its features many intriguing lexical similarities to language from the north. So it's really a puzzle, and I don't think it's one we will ever solve because the language is extinct and we don't know anything more about the language. But anyway, very interesting. I didn't know about this Curichi.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I think that there are probably no more questions, and it's already 10 o'clock here in Moscow. So once again, Fernando, thanks a lot for the excellent talk, and I'm sure we all learned a lot of new things and plenty of stuff to think about and consider. So Mish, do you want to add something?
I want to thank you for the very interesting talk. So I'm glad that.
And I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad you guys liked it. And as I said, it's just great to start interacting with you guys. And I hope we can do more. So.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is not the last time, hopefully just the first time. And now, you know, since our seminars now regularly take place online and in Zoom, this is a great opportunity to have more international and intercontinental contact. So thank you very much, Fernando. And I'm stopping.
Thank you guys.
Now.